The autumn wind carried the scent of smoke and fear across the Dakota plains as Sarah Running Bear pressed herself against the rough bark of an old cottonwood tree. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts that created small clouds in the crisp October air. Behind her, the sound of hoofbeats grew fainter, but she knew the danger had not passed. The men who had attacked her village would return, and when they did, they would be looking for survivors. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon until they settled on a small ranch house nestled in a valley below. Smoke rose peacefully from its chimney, and she could see cattle grazing in nearby pastures. The sight filled her with both hope and terror. White settlers had brought nothing but trouble to her people, yet this might be her only chance for shelter. Sarah's traditional dress was torn from her desperate flight through thorny underbrush. Her long black hair, usually braided with care, now hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. Blood stained her moccasins from cuts she had received while running barefoot across rocky ground. Every muscle in her body ached, but she forced herself to move toward the ranch. The man she saw chopping wood near the house was tall and lean, with weathered hands that spoke of years working the land. His brown hair was streaked with early gray, and deep lines around his eyes suggested someone who had seen both hardship and determination. When he looked up and saw her approaching, he stopped mid-swing with his axe. Thomas Mackenzie had built his ranch with his own hands after the war ended. He had come west seeking peace and solitude, hoping to leave behind memories of battlefields and broken promises. The last thing he expected was to find a young Lakota woman stumbling toward his property, clearly in distress. Sarah stopped several yards away, her chest heaving from exhaustion and fear. She could see the surprise in his blue eyes, but also something else that gave her courage to speak. "May I stay here until the bandits pass?" she asked, her English careful but clear. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to sound strong. Thomas set down his axe slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He had heard stories about raids in the area, tales of men who attacked both white settlements and native villages without discrimination. These were not soldiers or settlers defending their land, but outlaws who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. He studied her face, seeing the exhaustion and terror she was trying so hard to hide. Her clothes told a story of desperate flight, and the way she kept glancing over her shoulder revealed that whatever had happened was recent and traumatic. Thomas had lost his own family to violence during the war, and he recognized the look of someone who had witnessed unspeakable things. Without speaking, he nodded. Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. She had expected rejection, perhaps even hostility. But this man's simple gesture of acceptance was more kindness than she had dared hope for. She bowed her head slightly in gratitude, a gesture that came from years of traditional upbringing. Thomas gestured toward his house. "You're hurt," he observed, noticing the blood on her feet and the way she favored her left side. "Come inside. My wife used to keep medicine supplies." The mention of his wife in past tense was not lost on Sarah, but she was too grateful to ask questions. She followed him toward the modest wooden structure, each step a reminder of how far she had traveled and what she had left behind. The interior of the house was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and curtains that had clearly been sewn by careful hands. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the warmth from its flames felt like heaven against her chilled skin. Thomas moved to a cabinet and retrieved a small wooden box filled with bandages and bottles of medicine. "Sit," he said, indicating a chair near the fire. His voice was gentle but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sarah hesitated for just a moment before settling into the chair, wincing as her injured body protested the movement. Thomas knelt beside her and began examining her injuries with practiced efficiency. His touch was careful and respectful, reminding Sarah of her grandfather, who had been a healer in their village. The thought of her grandfather brought fresh tears to her eyes, and she struggled to maintain her composure. "What happened?" Thomas asked quietly, as he cleaned the cuts on her feet. He didn't look at her face, giving her the privacy to decide how much she wanted to share. Sarah took a shaky breath. "Bad men came to our village 3 days ago. They had guns and torches. They took what they wanted and burned the rest." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, but she continued. "My grandmother told me to run to the sacred caves in the hills. She said to hide until it was safe." Thomas's hands stilled for a moment. He had heard rumors of such attacks, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it made the reality far more painful. "Your family," he asked gently. Sarah's silence was answer enough. Thomas resumed his work, wrapping her feet in clean bandages with careful precision. When he finished, he stood and moved to the kitchen area, returning with a cup of hot coffee and a plate of bread and meat. "You need to eat," he said, setting the food on a small table beside her chair. "And rest. Those men you're running from won't find you here." Sarah accepted the food gratefully, though eating felt strange when her world had been turned upside down so completely. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the herbal teas her people preferred, but it warmed her from the inside out. As she ate, Thomas settled into a chair across from her. He didn't stare or ask more questions, but his presence was comforting in a way she hadn't expected. The silence between them was not awkward but peaceful, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle. "Why did you help me?" Sarah asked suddenly, the question emerging before she could stop herself. "Your people and mine are not friends." Thomas considered her words carefully before responding. "I've learned that good and evil don't depend on the color of a person's skin or the language they speak. You asked for help, and I could give it. That's enough reason for me." His answer surprised Sarah with its simplicity and honesty. In her experience, white men usually had complicated reasons for their actions, motivations that often involved taking something in return for any kindness shown. But this man seemed different, and she found herself beginning to relax for the first time in days. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was approaching. Sarah pulled the blanket Thomas had given her more tightly around her shoulders and stared into the dancing flames of the fireplace. For the moment, she was safe, fed, and warm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she could simply exist without running or hiding. Thomas watched her profile in the firelight, noting the strength in her features despite her youth and recent trauma. He had made his decision to help her impulsively, driven by basic human decency rather than careful consideration. Now, as the reality of the situation settled in, he wondered what complications this act of kindness might bring to his quiet life. But looking at this brave young woman who had survived horrors he could barely imagine, Thomas knew he had made the right choice. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination that had carried him through war and personal loss. For now, it was enough that she was safe. Morning came slowly to the Dakota plains, painted in shades of gold and amber that stretched endlessly toward distant hills. Sarah woke gradually, confused for a moment about where she was before memory crashed back like cold water. The events of recent days felt like a terrible dream, but the ache in her body and the unfamiliar surroundings confirmed their reality. She had slept in Thomas's wife's sewing room, wrapped in quilts that still carried the faint scent of lavender. Through the small window, she could see Thomas already at work, feeding cattle and checking fence posts with the methodical patience of a man who understood that daily tasks provided stability in an uncertain world. Sarah rose carefully, testing her bandaged feet against the wooden floor. The pain was manageable, and she felt stronger after a full night's sleep. She folded the quilts neatly and made her way to the kitchen, where coffee was already brewing and fresh bread sat cooling on the counter. Thomas entered through the back door, stomping mud from his boots and hanging his coat on a wooden peg. "You're awake," he observed, his tone neither surprised nor disappointed. "How do you feel?" "Better," Sarah replied honestly. "Thank you for everything. I know this is not easy for you." Thomas poured himself coffee and gestured for her to do the same. "I've been thinking," he said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "Those men you're running from might come through here eventually. We should be prepared." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with fear, but Thomas's calm demeanor helped keep her panic at bay. "What do you mean?" "I mean we need to know who we're dealing with and what they want. If they're just passing through, we wait them out. If they're searching for something specific, we need a different plan." Thomas studied her face over his coffee cup. "Were you the only one who escaped?" The question brought fresh pain, but Sarah forced herself to answer. "I think so. My grandmother pushed me toward the caves when the shooting started. She told me to run and keep running until I found safety." Sarah's voice caught slightly. She said the old ways were ending, and I had to find new ways to survive. Thomas nodded slowly. He had seen enough war to understand the weight of such sacrifices. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She knew you had the strength to survive." "I don't feel strong," Sarah admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup. "I feel lost and afraid." Strength isn't the absence of fear, Thomas replied quietly. It's continuing to move forward despite being afraid. You've been doing that for 3 days now. His words offered comfort she hadn't expected, and Sarah found herself studying this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. You said yesterday that your wife used to keep medicine supplies. What happened to her? Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. Cholera took her 2 years ago, along with our son. They're buried on the hill behind the barn. Sarah felt a deep ache of sympathy. Loss was something she understood intimately now, and she recognized the particular kind of pain that came from losing family to circumstances beyond anyone's control. I'm sorry, she said simply. So am I, Thomas replied. But life continues, and we honor the dead by living the best we can. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people who had experienced profound loss finding solace in shared understanding. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, warming the room and creating patterns of light and shadow on the wooden table. Around mid-morning, the sound of approaching horses shattered their peaceful routine. Thomas was immediately alert, moving to the window to peer carefully through the curtains. Sarah felt her heart begin racing, and she instinctively moved away from the window. 4 men, Thomas reported quietly. Armed, but they don't look like they're in a hurry. Could be they're just passing through. Sarah moved to where she could see through a crack in the curtains. The riders were rough-looking men with the kind of casual cruelty in their faces that spoke of violence as a way of life. She recognized the leader immediately, a scarred man with dead eyes who had been among those who attacked her village. That's him, she whispered, terror making her voice barely audible. The one in front. He killed my cousin right in front of me. Thomas felt a cold anger settle in his chest, but he kept his voice calm and steady. Go to the root cellar behind the pantry. There's a hidden door covered by the rug. Stay there no matter what you hear, and don't come out until I call for you specifically. Sarah wanted to protest, to tell him she wouldn't hide while he faced danger alone. But the practical wisdom her grandmother had taught her overruled her emotions. She squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture of gratitude and farewell, then disappeared into the pantry. Thomas checked his rifle and positioned himself near the front door, but not directly in front of it. He had learned during the war that preparation often meant the difference between living and dying, and these men had the look of trouble about them. The knock on his door was more of a demand than a request, heavy and insistent. Thomas waited a moment before opening it, projecting the calm confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. Morning, he said evenly, noting the way the men's eyes immediately began scanning his property for signs of what they were seeking. Morning, the scarred leader replied, though his tone held no friendliness. We're tracking some stolen horses. Thought they might have come this way. Thomas knew immediately that this was a lie, but he played along. Haven't seen any stray horses. Been pretty quiet out here. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. Mind if we take a look around? Sometimes tracks can be hard to spot. I'd prefer you didn't, Thomas replied calmly. This is private property, and I don't know you men. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife. The other 3 men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Thomas remained perfectly still, his own rifle within easy reach but not obviously threatening. Now that's not very neighborly, the leader said with a cold smile. We're just trying to recover stolen property, and I'm just trying to protect mine, Thomas replied. If you're lawmen, show me your badges. Otherwise, I'll ask you to move along. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before the leader's expression shifted to one of barely controlled violence. Maybe we don't need your permission, he suggested, his hand now resting openly on his gun handle. Thomas felt the familiar calm that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. Maybe not, he agreed quietly. But maybe you should consider whether whatever you're really looking for is worth dying for. The leader studied Thomas's face, clearly trying to determine if this was bluff or genuine threat. What he saw in the rancher's steady gaze apparently convinced him that Thomas was not a man to be intimidated easily. We'll be moving on then, the leader said finally, though his tone promised this was not over. But we might be back this way. Hope we don't have any misunderstandings next time. I hope so too, Thomas replied, his meaning perfectly clear. The 4 men rode away slowly, making it obvious they were reluctant to leave. Thomas watched from his window until they disappeared over a rise, then waited another 10 minutes before calling Sarah from her hiding place. When she emerged from the cellar, her face was pale but determined. "They'll be back," she said with certainty. "That man doesn't give up easily." Thomas nodded grimly. "I figured as much. Which means we need to make some decisions about what happens next." Sarah looked around the kitchen where she had felt safe just hours before, knowing that safety was now an illusion. "I should leave," she said reluctantly. "I'm bringing danger to you." "Where would you go?" Thomas asked practically. "Winter's coming, and you have no supplies, no horse, nowhere safe to run to." The truth of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She was completely alone in a world that had become hostile and unpredictable. Her old life was gone forever, and she had no clear path toward a new one. "Then what do we do?" she asked, struggling to keep despair from overwhelming her. Thomas moved to the window again, studying the horizon with the careful attention of a man making battle plans. "We get ready," he said simply, "and we make sure that when they come back, we're not as easy a target as they expect us to be." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Thomas worked with the methodical efficiency of a military man, checking weapons, securing the house, and planning defensive positions. Sarah proved to be an invaluable ally, her knowledge of tracking and survival complementing his tactical experience in ways that surprised them both. She taught him how to read signs that most white men would miss, showing him the subtle indicators that revealed when someone was watching the property from a distance. In return, he showed her how to load and fire his spare rifle, though she was already more familiar with firearms than he had expected. "My father traded with white trappers," Sarah explained as she practiced her aim on targets Thomas had set up behind the barn. "He said I needed to know their weapons as well as our traditional ones." Thomas watched her steady hands and natural stance with growing respect. "Your father was a smart man." "He was," Sarah agreed, her voice carrying both pride and sadness. "He always said that survival meant adapting without losing who you are inside." As they worked together, an unexpected partnership began to develop between them. They discovered they shared a similar dry sense of humor, a practical approach to problem solving, and a quiet determination that had carried them both through previous hardships. The differences in their backgrounds became less important than their shared goal of survival. On the 4th morning, Sarah's keen eyes spotted dust on the horizon long before Thomas would have noticed it. "They're coming," she announced quietly, setting down the bucket of feed she had been carrying to the chickens. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady. "How many?" Sarah squinted into the distance, reading the signs with practiced skill. "More than before. At least 8, maybe 10, and they're bringing supplies, not just passing through." Thomas nodded grimly. They had expected this, but the reality was still sobering. "Remember the plan," he said as they moved quickly toward the house. "No matter what happens, don't take unnecessary risks." Sarah checked her rifle one final time and took her position at the upstairs window that offered the best view of the approaching riders. Thomas positioned himself downstairs where he could cover the front entrance and still communicate with her. The riders approached more boldly this time, spreading out to surround the house rather than simply riding up to the front door. Thomas recognized the tactical formation and felt a cold certainty that these men had military experience, probably from the wrong side of various conflicts. The scarred leader dismounted about 50 yards from the house and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the morning air. "Mackenzie, we know you're hiding something that belongs to us. Send out the Indian girl, and nobody has to get hurt." Thomas felt a surge of protective anger but kept his voice level when he replied through the window. "There's nobody here but me. You men need to move along before this gets out of hand." "We tracked her here, Mackenzie," the leader shouted back. "Blood trail, footprints, the whole story. She killed 2 of my men during our business at her village, and she's going to pay for it." Sarah felt her stomach lurch at this lie, but she understood its purpose. These men needed a justification for their violence, even if they were the only ones who believed it. Thomas's voice carried the authority of absolute conviction when he responded, "You're mistaken, and you're on my property without permission. I'm giving you one chance to ride away before I defend my home." The leader's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Your home? That's funny, Mackenzie. After today, you won't need to worry about property lines." The attack began with a shot that shattered the kitchen window, followed immediately by the sound of men moving to surround the house. Thomas had expected this and was already in motion, using the furniture and walls he had prepared as cover. Sarah's first shot took down one of the men trying to approach from the back, her grandmother's teachings about patience and precision serving her well. The man fell cleanly, and his companions immediately took cover. Realizing they were facing more resistance than they had anticipated, Thomas's military training served him well as he moved between windows, making each shot count and forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. The house had been built solidly, and his preparations had turned it into a formidable defensive position. "Mackenzie," the leader called out after several minutes of unsuccessful assault. "This doesn't have to be so hard. Just give us the girl, and we'll leave you in peace." "Go to hell," Thomas replied succinctly, punctuating his words with a shot that came uncomfortably close to the leader's position behind a water trough. The battle continued for over an hour, with the attackers finding it increasingly difficult to advance against the well-coordinated defense. Sarah's ability to spot movement and anticipate approaches proved invaluable, while Thomas's experience and steady nerves kept them organized and effective. But gradually, the attackers began to gain ground through sheer persistence and numbers. Thomas realized they were running low on ammunition and needed to change tactics before they were overwhelmed. "Sarah," he called upstairs during a brief lull in the shooting. "We need to move to the barn. Can you make it to the back door?" "Yes," she replied immediately, understanding that staying in the house was no longer viable. They moved together, covering each other as they crossed the dangerous open ground between the house and barn. Sarah's speed and agility helped them reach safety just as several attackers burst through the front door of the house. Inside the barn, Thomas had prepared a final defensive position with clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes. The structure was older but sturdier than it appeared, and he had reinforced it over the past few days. The attackers approached more cautiously now, having learned to respect their opponent's skill and determination, but they still held numerical superiority, and everyone involved knew that the siege could only end one way without intervention. That intervention came from an unexpected source. The sound of many horses approaching at a gallop caused both sides to pause and assess this new development. Through gaps in the barn walls, Sarah could see a group of riders approaching rapidly from the east. "Cavalry," Thomas breathed, recognizing the formation and discipline of the approaching force. The scarred leader apparently reached the same conclusion, because his voice carried a note of frustrated rage when he called out to his men. "Mount up! We're leaving!" The attackers retreated quickly, but not before the leader shouted one final threat toward the barn. "This isn't over. Mackenzie, we'll be back when your soldier boys aren't here to protect you." Thomas and Sarah emerged cautiously from the barn as the cavalry unit rode into the yard. The lieutenant in charge was a young man with serious eyes and the bearing of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. "Are you folks all right?" he asked, dismounting and approaching with his hand extended. "We heard gunfire from several miles away. We're fine now," Thomas replied, shaking the officer's hand gratefully. "Thanks to your timing. We've been tracking those men for 3 days," the lieutenant explained. "They've been raiding settlements and native camps indiscriminately, taking whatever they wanted and leaving destruction behind." Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised with quiet dignity. "They attacked my village. They killed my family." The lieutenant's expression grew grave. "I'm sorry for your loss, miss. We're going to do everything we can to bring those men to justice." Thomas placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. "She's under my protection," he said firmly. "Whatever happens next, I want that understood." The lieutenant nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir. The army has no quarrel with peaceful civilians, regardless of their heritage." As the cavalry unit prepared to continue their pursuit, Sarah found herself standing beside Thomas, watching the soldiers organize their equipment and check their weapons. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the danger had passed, but she knew their lives had been changed forever. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, voicing the question that had been weighing on both their minds. Thomas looked down at her, seeing not just the young woman who had sought shelter from bandits, but a partner who had fought beside him with courage and skill. "Now we rebuild," he said simply. "Both of us." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a tentative hope that she hadn't dared to feel since the attack on her village. "Together, if you want," Thomas replied, his voice carrying both invitation and promise. "Your grandmother was right about the old ways ending, but maybe that doesn't mean you have to face the new ways alone." Sarah looked around at the ranch that had become her refuge, then at the man who had offered her not just shelter, but partnership and respect. The future was uncertain, and she knew there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time since the tragedy that had destroyed her old life, she could envision building something new. "Yes," she said softly, the word carrying the weight of decision and hope. "I think I'd like that very much." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features and revealing glimpses of the man he had been before loss and hardship had marked him. "Then we'd better get started. There's a lot of work to do before winter." As they walked back toward the house together, Sarah felt her grandmother's spirit walking beside them, approving of this new path that honored both tradition and adaptation. The old ways were ending, but perhaps something worthwhile could grow from the ashes of what had been lost. The sun climbed higher over the Dakota plains, warming the earth and promising new possibilities for those brave enough to embrace them. Behind them, the cavalry rode toward justice, but ahead lay the harder and more rewarding work of building a life based on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the quiet courage of two people who had found strength in each other when the world seemed determined to tear them apart.